Hi, I'm Rebecca Frank. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Michigan School of Information, and I'm here to talk about financial uncertainty in CoreTrustSeal certified repositories. I'm going to take you through the study that I did today. We're going to first start with background and research questions. I'll tell you a little bit about my methods, then we'll move on to findings and we'll discuss. I will say I'm going to move very quickly through background and methods. This is not my first attempt at recording this presentation. I have been long each time, and so I am going to shorten those sections quite a bit for the talk here, but I'm happy to answer questions about them at a future point in time. So, background, Core Trust Seal. Core Trust Seal is a certification process that allows us to evaluate digital repositories to understand whether they are able to preserve and provide access to the information that they are tasked with taking care of long term. Certification processes like CoreTrustSeal are ultimately an exercise in risk assessment, um, meaning it's a process that asks repository staff to show that they understand the risks facing their organization and their data, and that they have mitigation measures in place. It's a process that involves review by external stakeholders, right? There's a panel of reviewers, you submit documentation, and ultimately certification is awarded if a repository meets the criteria. In this project, I'm asking about staff members of certified repositories and how they characterize sources of risk and uncertainty, how they understand the value of certification, and whether that value can be attributed to process or outcome. Let's talk methods. Results here are based on a survey of CoreTrustSeal members. I had a response rate of 53.98%, which I'm particularly pleased with because of how many questions asked for write-in responses, including the questions that I've analyzed for this presentation here, which focus on what is the primary value of certification, what is the most significant risk to your repository, and what is the most significant source of uncertainty for your repository. Not small questions, right? I analyzed them using a qualitative coding approach, including inter-rater reliability to ensure quality and consistency. Happy to talk about this at a future point. A little bit of information about the respondents. So many of them had engaged in the certification process in multiple ways, including document preparation, interaction with members of the audit team, and a variety of other things. About a third also had experience as reviewers, meaning they had engaged with certification processes not just for their own organization, but for other repositories as well. All of these things demonstrate a pretty deep level of engagement with CoreTrustSeal certification. Okay, findings. So when it comes to risks and uncertainties, I think it will not be surprising to the NDSA community here that finance was both a major uncertainty and a significant risk. Um, Setting that aside for just a minute, let's talk risks specifically. So what I found was that risks aligned with the framework that I was looking at. So finance, legal, organizational infrastructure, repository processes, and technical infrastructure. Um, and the three that I want to highlight that were really prominent, one is money, right? Lack of funding is a risk. Threats to current funding also risky. But especially in combination with organizational infrastructure and technical infrastructure, right? So organizational infrastructure means staffing, um, expertise, relationships, organizations, that interacts with finance because you must pay the people who work for you, right? So a threat to funding is a threat to staffing. Same with technical infrastructure, software, hardware, equipment, facilities. Like once again, you must be able to financially support all of those things. Uncertainty, aside from financial uncertainty, I also found uncertainty around data and infrastructure, really focusing on um, understanding changing technologies and future needs, and the designated community, right? Um, Respondents expressed a lot of uncertainty about how to understand their designated community and how to anticipate future needs of their designated community. So the common thread across both of these categories is money. I want you to keep that in your minds as we move to the next question. So what was the primary value of certification? I found three categories of value: internal, external, and preservation guarantees. Those internal values tended to be things that came out of the process of becoming certified. So going through the certification process helped us to improve our processes and to create needed documentation. It helped us to establish a shared understanding among our staff about our goals and processes. It helped us to improve our risk mitigation efforts. All of those are things that come through that process of preparing documentation to try and meet those requirements. External values tended to be things that you could do once you had achieved certification, or things that having achieved certification accomplished. So it gave a basis for communication with repository stakeholders and especially funders, right? So money again. Um, It was a demonstration of trustworthiness to users. It encouraged data sharing and deposit. It demonstrated alignment with best practices as established by the broader community. It provided a competitive advantage. Um, and it established both expectations of quality and a common vocabulary across the community. So all things that having that like stamp, the core trust seal of approval stamp, um, afforded a repository, right? Preservation guarantees was an interesting category. I found a substantial amount of responses gave me some version of it guarantees our content is preserved. It guarantees we are trustworthy. It guarantees preservation. Um, it provides guarantees to our community, our users, my boss. Um, this was a really interesting point that I think is sort of worth thinking about as a direction for future. But let's stick with that thread of finance. And now let's think about certification as something that is communicating with funders about repositories' trustworthiness. So, a little bit of evidence to highlight and sort of demonstrate what I'm talking about here. Um, The most significant risk is the stable long-term funding support, right? This was like a very emblematic quote from a respondent. I had a hard time choosing just these four. Secure long-term funding in a time of change, right? Lack of funding is a risk to staff and expertise. So funding is like at risk, but also the loss of funding puts other things at risk. Having achieved certification, right, the repository has better arguments in discussions with its funders. Um, Funders need to know whether repository um, is a good choice for researchers to use, right? So having that stamp tells funders something important about the organization. So what does this all mean? The process of TDR certification and CoreTrustSeal in particular is about identifying risks and demonstrating that the repository has mitigation measures in place, right? So the process is a tool for risk mitigation. Um, and then having achieved certification is evidence that you have mitigated risk. However, findings here suggest that certification in and of itself is also an important risk mitigation technique. Financial uncertainty was far and away the most prominent risk and greatest source of uncertainty among respondents, not only on its own, but in combination with other risks, such as organizational infrastructure or maintaining enough staff with the right expertise and experience, and technical infrastructure, maintaining infrastructure, replacing, upgrading equipment as necessary into the future. So what we have is staff from certified repositories saying they're certified as trustworthy for long-term preservation and therefore have demonstrated that they've addressed risks related to funding, like per the requirements in the CoreTrustSeal checklist, but also that uncertainty about funding and therefore staff, equipment, etc., is the most significant risk for those same certified repositories and is a factor that contributes to other types of risk. So I also found that an important benefit of certification is that it provides a way to communicate with stakeholders and especially funders in order to assure them about a repository's trustworthiness for long-term preservation, which includes having addressed financial risk. So what this means is that certification itself is the tool that repositories are using to help address the problem of financial uncertainty. But in order to achieve certification, they need to have already addressed that issue. So there's a disconnect here between the level of financial stability required for certification and the level required that or the level that repository staff believe is necessary, right? But also recall what repository staff were making claims that certification is a guarantee of preservation. So we have this sort of cycle or like a chicken or the egg problem. Certification is a way to make your repository attractive to funders in order to manage financial uncertainty. But the expectation is that already being certified is what makes repositories attractive to funders. Do we see the problem? I think so. Um, so I've found in my research that certification does a lot of things, but its benefits did not include eliminating or directly addressing the biggest risk, which is financial uncertainty. The indirect ways that it could address risk were both concrete and speculative. The benefits of certification kind of danced around this risk, but it wasn't like directly addressed. Um, so if certification, right, a process of risk assessment meant to indicate to the outside world that a repository has identified and addressed major risks, doesn't directly address the most pressing risk-facing repositories, I think this troubles claims about trustworthiness and guarantees of preservation. It becomes a bigger problem when we think about how prominent certification is becoming. I think we need ways of ensuring that organizations entrusted with digital information are up to the task, but assuming the current system works as intended, and treating certification as a binary yes, no, trustworthy or not, obscures the fact that identifying risks and documenting mitigation plans is not enough. So future directions for this research include additional work to understand the CoreTrustSeal certification system, also more broadly, the social construction of risk in digital preservation. I would like to briefly thank the CoreTrustSeal board for assistance in distributing the survey. This project was funded in part by the Einstein Center Digital Future, and there are many research assistants who have contributed to this project over time. I've provided a list of related publications for anyone interested. Thank you so much.